Before we get started, Data Skeptic listeners, I just want to remind you, May 30th, 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. Pacific time, we're doing this Data Skeptic live stream. It's been 6 years of doing the podcast. This is going to be a little bit behind the scenes. And of course, we'll do some Q&A and that kind of stuff, so be ready if you have any questions. But on top of that, I'm going to show you guys not just behind the scenes meet the team, but we'll take a deep dive look at how some of our back-end systems work and where we're deploying machine learning and a lot of tools like that for our own production work. Coming up quick, mark your calendars. Saturday, May 30th, 4 to 7 Pacific time. Go to dataskeptic.com/live for more details. My guest this week is Frank Mollica. He's one of the authors on the recent paper, Humans Store About 1.5 Megabytes of Information During Language Acquisition. It should come as no surprise that was an intriguing title, and I'm glad to have had the chance to explore with Frank how he arrived at that number. And thanks to The Great Courses Plus, our sponsor, check them out at thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. Now on to the interview.
Hi, I'm Frank Mollica. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Melbourne.
Frank, thanks for coming on so much today. To kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about your background, what you study, and the kind of things you're interested in?
So I study computational cognitive science, which is basically what the mental representations and processes are that go on and support your sort of daily cognitive life.
And what is the overlap between a field like that and something like artificial intelligence, if at all?
We actually do have a lot of overlap because representations and processes are kind of the bread and butter of both artificial intelligence and sort of cognitive representations and processes in sort of cognitive psychology. So there's overlap in terms of how we like to formalize what we study, and the kinds of questions that we capture sometimes overlap.
Well, the title of a paper you recently are one of the lead authors on caught my attention. Humans store about 1.5 megabytes of information during language acquisition. Maybe let's start with language acquisition. What does that specifically mean?
So here what we're talking about is how humans actually have to come to learn the linguistic representations that they use in their language. So specifically, there's a whole bunch of different, sounds that our mouths can make. How do we figure out which sounds are the sounds in our language? And so how much information do we have to store about those representations?
Gotcha. And does that just account for the sounds? Is it only I think there's something like 44 phonemes in English, plus or minus a few in other languages? Or are there other structures that you want to study as well?
Right. So language is rich with structure, and linguists have been studying the different levels of structure that language has for centuries. The trick here with our sort of paper was how to make that tractable. And so we focused on just a few sort of levels of linguistic representation. Specifically, I think we worked on phonemes, phonemic word forms, lexical semantics, so what does a word mean, word frequency information, and then syntactic structures, how we combine words to make sentences.
And is there any consensus on when we do this as human beings? I assume I'm going to do it for the rest of my life, but it seems like the bulk of it got done early.
I don't know if there's any real endpoint to language acquisition per se. We constantly come up with new words. Like if you asked, my grandpa what tweet was, he would say it's a bird sound. But you ask, like a 14-year-old, hey, what's this tweet? They're not going to think anything to do with a bird. So language is constantly changing, but at different levels of representation, probably there's different cutoff points for when you've acquired linguistic ability or linguistic competence. For example, things like syntax or the sounds of your language, right? Phonemes, your phonology. That's relatively acquired earlier, with phonology acquired really early. We're talking the first couple years of life, and syntax 5 to 7 years.
Gotcha. And let's talk a little bit about the measurement process. How do you go about coming up with an estimate for how many bits of information are necessary to formalize language like this?
Yeah, so this was fun. We started off by assuming that there are a whole bunch of representations that are possible that different languages might use in the world. There are a whole bunch of different sounds that could be made, but languages only use a small inventory of these sounds. And so the idea is that a learner has to consider this full space of possible sounds and identify which ones are in their language. Less of the process of the learner, but that's more a process of how much information they have to store. They have to store enough information to tell you, of this full range of possible, speech sounds that we could make, which are the ones that are used by my language. And so we make a lot of assumptions about what that underlying representation space should be. And then we try and say, okay, well, what is the actual perceptual uncertainty or the cognitive representation and the associated uncertainty in the adult, right, the linguistically competent individual? And the difference between the uncertainty over the full space and the uncertainty that adult has is how much information a language user must store.
Are there any historical alternative or ways people were trying to measure this before your methodology was introduced?
Yeah, so we sort of use a Fermi estimation approach with information theoretic assumptions to back us up. But before that, memory researchers have been using a variety of cognitive science techniques to try and estimate the capacity of different memory systems. Some we actually end up using in the paper as well. For example, looking at frequency judgments and using the error rates to infer mental capacity for word frequency. And then there's other approaches that have actually tried to sort of estimate memory capacity less from a cognitive functional perspective, but more from a neuroanatomical perspective, putting limits on the amount of information that can be transferred via a fixed number of neurons.
And let's talk a little bit more about your methodology. Was there a data set you were basing this on or any empirical components? Where do you begin the analysis, I guess?
We actually use a lot of different data sets and computational resources depending on which level of analysis. When we were looking at the sounds of a language, right, so the phonological inventory, we drew from empirical work that actually attempted to explain the perceptual magnet effect. So in speech, when we hear a sound, we actually can pull our perception of that sound towards our stored representation. And so colleagues have estimated what the uncertainty of the stored representation is. And so we just directly pulled their uncertainty estimates for our analysis. When you look at lexical semantics, there's a rich history of using sort of vector space models to represent lexical semantics, following sort of Firth's, the meaning of a word is given by the company that it keeps. And so we just drew from rich vector space representations that exist when we were making assumptions for lexical semantics. And there we use WordNet to identify how close individual concepts are within semantic spaces. Again, all of these are assumptions, and it's actually a really nice way to lay out all of the assumptions that exist when you're trying to do one of these tasks. It lays like a groundwork for future work.
And a moment ago, you were mentioning that you were following, I think you described it as the Thermi Methods. Could you describe a little bit about what that means in the context of your work?
So what we're doing here is not trying to precisely estimate down to the smallest number of bits exactly what the capacity for language is. Rather, what we're interested in is the order of magnitude. So famously, we're going to use like Enrico Fermi's method. The tale of the story is that there is a bomb explosion, and he threw scraps of paper, and he watched how far they blew away in the wake of the explosion. And based off of just how far they blew away, he did some mental calculations on the back of an envelope and came up with an estimate that was on the same order of magnitude of how strong the explosion actually was.
I have to say, I hadn't known that until I read it in your paper, and I found that idea to be almost crazy. It was sort of shocking to me that this very uncontrolled method could lead us to the right answer or get close to the right answer. Am I alone, or does that seem like a sort of a brute way of measuring things, the paper thrown into the bomb's radius, I guess?
I mean, it is a very coarse way of doing it, but oftentimes you can do these kind of like Fermi estimation tasks, and you are able to estimate surprising quantities and place bounds on things that you wouldn't normally get at if you were, concerned about being very precise. In that regard, it's actually really useful because placing order of magnitude bounds on things like mental capacities can really help constrain the types of theories or the types of algorithms that you think are going on. You can't predict something that's like orders of magnitude greater than the bound.
Right. That leads me to another interesting point. If it's truly the case that, relatively speaking, language fits in, approximately 1.5 megabytes, and as we said, that's sort of the size of just about a little bigger than a 3.5-inch floppy disk. I remember those, and not that much fits on them. It's, in a way, then a shocking upper bound that natural language processing people in computer science, they haven't cracked the code yet. It should all fit on one disk. What do you think they're missing?
So what I would argue and sort of clarify right away is that what we're giving is not the actual process algorithm. This is not like the algorithmic complexity that they would need to actually use language. This is the amount of information that you need to just store it. So you can think of this as like, this is how much information you'd need to like load and have ready to go if you wanted to, then use language. You need to like preload this amount of representation space.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. It's not the algorithmic part. It's presumably a very information-dense representation, I would guess.
Yeah, arguably.
And then that representation, let's dig into it a little bit more. So we touched on a little bit with information about phonemes. We haven't so much talked about the word forms as much. Maybe could you talk a little bit about measuring information in word forms and then perhaps some of the math behind it?
So, in dealing with the information about word forms, there's a lot of assumptions that we actually have to figure out, right? We have to figure out what a word is, how many of them are sort of in a linguistic inventory. And so, based off of previous research, we kind of just took an estimate of, I believe, 40,000 words and idioms as sort of our go to number that we were just going to run with our sort of Fermi estimations with. And then to estimate the phonemic word form, and the phonemic word form is just the actual phoneme string that corresponds to a word. What we had to do was figure out, well, how much information content does an adult actually store about this word? Or I guess how much information content is there about phonemic symbols in a word? And the idea is that if you're a learner, you have no idea how much information that is to like maximum entropy. But after you've learned, you still maintain a certain amount of uncertainty over sort of the word's identity in online processing. So to estimate the actual information content of a word, we look at what ends up being the surprisal, or the negative log probability of the word under a probability model. And here we use n-phone models, which are similar to like n-gram models. And the idea is that we're going to be predicting the next phoneme given the previous context.
Thanks to this week's sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. The Great Courses Plus streaming service is an excellent resource to expand your knowledge on a variety of subjects. You can gain valuable, reliable insights from some of the world's best teachers. You can get a better understanding of things that are going on. I like the variety of topics I can find on the Great Courses Plus and how I can dabble into things that I have a cursory interest in and maybe see if I want to go deeper. Their library is a fantastic way to keep your mind active while staying close at home. The service streams onto all the popular platforms, so consider getting your family around the TV for some educational programming. Or do what I do and use the Great Courses Plus app while you're out doing a neighborhood walk or any other outdoor activities. I myself have been trimming the palm trees lately, a bigger job than you would think, while listening to The Scientific Wonder of Birds. This is a great 12 series of lectures on everything I wanted to know that I didn't quite know yet about birds. Migration, flock behavior, defense, and most interesting to me, their use of tools. There's so much more to learn about the world. Start by signing up at thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. They'll give you a free trial with unlimited access to their entire library. You can't go wrong here. Head over to thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. One more time, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. So there's the points we've covered and a couple others like measuring information about syntax and a few other things. How did you go about deciding what are the, I don't know if they're mechanisms or techniques or things to measure, but the scope of what you'd want to bite off in trying to capture all of the things that must be stored in order to understand and create language?
Right. So in choosing our domains, we went with convenience, basically. Which areas of language did we think that we had the most traction, the most computational resources that would enable us to properly get an estimate that wasn't crazy or just entirely assumption? At the end of the day, some of our estimates are purely assumption, which we do lay out nicely in the supplementary table. But the goal was to get areas of language representations or linguistic representations that people have studied in detail, where there was actually some skin in the game in terms of language acquisition. I say computational resources, I mean sufficient corpora or sufficient statistical information to get a handle on these things.
And I'm curious how your estimate has compared to other people's. Are we converging on a common answer, or are different methods giving us slightly different versions of the same truth?
The only other study that I'm aware of at the moment that has looked specifically at language would be Landauer's study in like the 1980s. And we actually converge on order of magnitude with Landauer's estimate. Our best guess and his estimate actually align.
Interesting. Would you, I don't know if take credit or put stock in it, whatever the right turn of phrase is, but would you chalk that up to possible coincidence, or does that really seem like we're converging from multiple analyses on the same answer?
I think given that we both looked at very similar types of representation, even though albeit in very different ways, the fact that we came to the same convergent answer is actually just good and normal, but it's conditioned purely on the fact that we looked at only these levels of linguistic representation. If we look at more levels of linguistic representation that are perhaps harder to actually estimate, our estimates might change wildly depending on how we do it.
Well, I'm going to bring my own personal bias to the table as someone trained in computer science and statistics and having an interest in AI and stuff like that. And the estimate to someone with that bias is shockingly small. We deal with things like the BERT model that's 8 gigabytes in memory. So it's exciting in a way that, hey, maybe there are aspects of language that are more compressible than we know today. Or maybe, I don't know, biological systems are just different in some kind of way from the computational way I look at the world. Do you have any thoughts on, how we measure the size of things in terms of the way the brain is going to operate on language?
Oh, I think that's a tricky question. I don't really think that we have that kind of linking hypothesis in place to really, connect brain activity to the sort of cognitive computational representations and processes yet. I totally think that's an area worth investigating in future research, but I'm not sure that we quite have the ability to make those comparisons yet.
I guess I was thinking that a lot of the work in the paper feels like some standard kind of lower bounds results almost, as if to say that the most efficient agent, it would require this many bits. And there's no guarantee that nature or evolution or whatever found us the most efficient path, but it seems pretty likely since we're doing okay with it. Yet I'm always kind of haunted by this idea that, well, I can't reinstall new software very easily in my brain. Maybe it's just fundamentally different. Do you think that there's a strong argument for that, or are these representations really less tied to the medium itself?
I'm going to argue that probably depends on the level of representation, for the sake of the conversation. I would think that would vary depending on the level of linguistic representation. There are some things that are more closed class. For example, the phonology, your speech sounds. Humans can only make so many sounds. But then there are other things that are open class, like the word inventory or the idiom inventory or the syntactic construction, like inventory of a language. Those things might not be optimized the same time scale that you would need for like an evolutionary like brain algorithm optimization. For example, our like sort of syntactic constructions and our lexical semantics, they change, like within your lifetime way faster than you could expect that to really travel down into the brain, being hardwired rather.
Can you tell me a little bit more about why the order of magnitude estimates is helpful? Like what sorts of research does a result like this guide? What kind of next questions do you ask?
So one of the reasons we actually attempted this cute estimation problem was that we wanted to be able to look at different learning mechanisms and go, all right, well, this learning mechanism, if it was operating super efficiently, how much information would a given data point give you? And how would that carry out? Is your learning mechanism sufficient enough to learn everything that you have to learn in order to be able to use a language within the time frame that humans do?
I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of the work that's been going on in the last few years with deep neural networks and building these AI models in TensorFlow or PyTorch or those sorts of frameworks. Do you think there's any guiding principles or wisdom that can come out of research like yours that might help those types of machine learning engineers better develop the systems they're working on?
Don't think there's anything directly. I guess one thing that I would say, when you look at the Fermi methods and our results, our estimation results, you see that the amount of bits that the model requires, or that learner requires rather, is substantially less than the amount of information that you would need for like your deep neural network. In some regards, this suggests that maybe the deep neural networks aren't storing or compressing the information the way that a human learner is. Some people might take that as obvious, and they're not necessarily doing the same tasks with that information. So I guess it's unclear to what extent we'd want to constrain, sort of deep neural networks based on or to fit our memory capacity estimates. But it does point to the need for strong generalizations.
So we were talking about that 200 bits of information daily acquisition, that's something we do for, give or take the first 18 years of life to really build up our understanding. That seems pretty impressive to me. Do you find that that's a high rate of absorption, or I guess what's your sort of perspective since you're closer to the research?
Yeah, I would consider that a lot of absorption, I guess. Although it also depends on what the actual learning mechanism is. For example, when we talk about lexical semantics, we do our lower bound, assuming that if you had 40,000 concepts in your head innately at birth, and then you magically learned 40,000 words, and now your task to learn language is to just map those words to those concepts. That still results in a large number of bits when you look at it. And so that technically is about 550,000 bits. But once you learn one word, like one mapping between, like the word form and the concept, you immediately get 15 bits of information because that one thing rules out 39,999 other possible pairings. At the beginning, right, when there's a lot to learn, every little thing that you learn might actually convey more information than towards the end. It all depends on what your learning mechanism actually is.
I've always been kind of impressed with the human learning mechanism, again, whatever it may be, but the ability for a person I could perhaps make up a word, for example, and if I start using it in context, it might only take the average human one or two examples before they say, like, oh, I think I know what his made up word means. Do you think that ability stems from some of these underlying techniques like, word understanding and the lexical mapping, or is that some higher order or cognitive function that allows me to learn with one or two shot examples like that?
I think there's a few things going on, and one of the things that best helps with learning from like few shot examples is learning actually structured representations as opposed to low level or dumb statistical associations. The structured representations allow you to generalize in interesting ways that you wouldn't necessarily get from just learning simple statistical association between like words and concepts.
I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on how this approach would extend into other languages. Do you think you'd find give or take the same number of bits?
I think on the same order of magnitude, I would hope so, but I really would rather do it than speculate wildly.
For sure, yeah. No, I'd absolutely love to see that done. I'm just reminded a bit, I don't know if you're familiar with Kolmogorov complexity, but it's an inherent measure of the innate complexity of something, and it's invariant to programming language that you want to represent it in, or whatever, doesn't even have to be a programming language, whatever language you express it in, there's this nice invariance theorem. And curious if you thought maybe there were some parallels there.
I guess I just don't know enough about the typology of the languages for some of the domains. For phonetic inventories, I wouldn't be surprised if they're on the same order of magnitude. For syntactic structures, similarly, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. But for lexical semantics, there are some languages that use rich derivational morphology to make words, and it's not clear to me how you would translate that easily into our framework. And as a result, it's unclear sort of how to properly estimate the number of words.
Definitely some challenges there around doing any task like that. So Frank, I assume as in most research, this is, one step in a long chain. Where do you see this going next? What are some of your big questions now?
So in general, I'm interested in applying sort of information theoretic models of communication as a normative model for language processing. And so moving on from estimating this from the acquisition standpoint, I've lately been trying to look at how different languages sort of optimize themselves over time to be communicatively efficient.
That's interesting. Could you maybe provide a simple example?
Yes. So for example, we've known for a really long time now, since at least the 1930s, that languages of the world, the word forms, the sort of length of the words, correspond to the predictability of those words in context. So if you need a word very frequently, it's going to be very short. This way, it's very efficient to speak it.
And you're able to measure that actually, I guess, over time. We have enough printed materials, you can see the evolution and introduction, maybe simplification of words?
Yes, so there's actually entire fields of linguistics that are focused on these different grammaticalization pathways, these different phonetic reduction pathways that show how word forms change over time.
Gotcha. I'm certainly out of my element with this, but I know Chomsky comes up here a lot. Am I in the right ballpark?
Yeah, Chomsky is a figure, but I would be thinking more of like Joan Bybee's work, who's another sort of famous linguist who's been looking at these different grammaticalization pathways.
Oh, great. I'll put a link to her research in the show notes. That'll be a nice fit. Well, Frank, thank you so much for coming on to share this work. Where can people follow you online?
You can follow me on Twitter at Francis Mollica.
Awesome. I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. Well, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I look forward to seeing other things you publish in the future as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being on the show.
Thanks for listening to Data Skeptic Interpretability. Our guest this week was Frank Mollica. Our theme song is Number 5 by Big D and the Kids Table. I will not use it on the live stream because I don't know if I'm going to get some weird takedown notice. May 30th. Head over to dataskeptic.com/live for more details. I really hope to see a lot of you guys there. You're going to get a chance to meet Claudia Armbruster, our associate producer, and Vanessa Burciaga, who does guest coordination. Naturally, I'll be there, your host, Kyle Polich. Stay in, even if the orders are lifted in your area. Stay safe, and take action now. Head over to thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. Let them know we sent you.